Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Bulkley Valley Research Seminar Series. Really pleased to be hosting Kevin Kriese today and for him to be sharing his knowledge with us around beneficial fire and increasing wildfire resilience. I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and it's an honor to host and have a fabulous conversation about the beautiful land that we all love to live on and recreate on.
Thanks for coming, everybody. And first thing I'll say is I don't actually think I have a lot of knowledge to share, but I hope I have some ideas. There's also a ton of people in this room who help with this kind of work. So I want to do a shout out to my colleague, Doug Donaldson, who's also with the POLIS Project. And they got people who are working on the Bulkley Morice, like Brad and Larry and Jeff. And there's a ton of other people in the room who are helping us hopefully build knowledge kind of as a wildfire community. So as I said, I'm Kevin Kriese. I'm with I wear two hats. One is I work with the POLIS Project on Ecological Governance at the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria, talking about wildfire resilience from a policy perspective. And that's where the basis of this project came from. And there's a report with copies at the back if you're interested in reading more. And I'm also working with the team here in the Bulkley Valley through the Bulkley Valley Research Center on a wildfire resilience project. And this presentation is going to connect the dots between those policy ideas and how they can start to land in this particular place and some of the work we're doing here with the Bulkley Valley Research Center. So we're going to talk a little bit about the wildfire crisis and beneficial fire, try and figure out what does this mean? What does this term beneficial fire mean? Where does it come from? How would you know that a fire is more beneficial than detrimental or catastrophic? Like, how do you think through that problem? And then end with a few of the things that can be done to kind of promote beneficial fire. I'm going to start with this term that's a bit loaded, but it is widely used both in the scientific literature in wildfire as well as in the popular literature, and that's the term wildfire crisis. So it's increasingly sort of recognized that, wildfire ain't doing us such a great service in these last, particularly 5 to 8 years. And the picture on the left, if you can see, is the picture of Lytton after 2021 when the entire village burned down, 2 people died. No question that is a catastrophic impact on a particular community. And that's emblematic of the wildfire crisis, combined with things like Jasper and evacuation of Fort Nelson and loss of homes in Kelowna and the Bush Creek fire, and you can go on and on and on, this kind of significant loss of communities. And the picture on the right is the other kind of picture of the story around behind the wildfire crisis. And that's a picture of the area burned in British Columbia. Off on the right are a series of different years that all start to lump together. 2017, 2018, 2021, 2023, 2024, and 2025 are all in the record books in terms of the area burned in British Columbia. So those two kind of symbols, people losing their homes, losing entire communities, being evacuated, combined with this really significant amount of land that's being burned, sort of emblemize that kind of idea that we have a wildfire crisis in British Columbia and across Canada. What's causing the wildfire crisis? I'm not going to get into this in a lot of depth, but there's a ton of emerging literature that sort of discerns which factors are most critical. There is no question that there is a climate driver. That's increasing drought, increasing heat, and in particular, this kind of idea of extreme weather. The whole climate change drives the tails. The tails drive extreme wildfire behavior. So it's when it gets really hot and really windy is when you have really significant wildfire problems. So we have a climate change driver. We also have a landscape condition. Fire deficit, you're going to come back to that idea. Accumulated fuels on the landscape. And that comes from a whole bunch of things, right from fire exclusion. End of the 19th century, colonial laws basically ended Indigenous fire, made it illegal to put fire on the landscape the way it had been. We began after the Second World War to suppress fires and putting out some of the fires that might have been necessary for ecosystems. And then you got things like in our part of the world, there's a mountain pine beetle epidemic, which undoubtedly causes more extreme fire behavior, larger fire size, larger areas burned. And then you got forest practices, and I'm going to probably be a little controversial on this. They're sometimes not helpful, they're sometimes bad, and they're sometimes helpful. So forest practices are a bit of one of these things where you have to really dive into what's going on in your ecosystem to know whether they're helping or hindering the wildfire crisis. But in some circumstances, forest practices contribute to this kind of wildfire crisis. And the last one, I think this is probably one of the stated ones. Is the problem the fires, or is the problem that we're living where fires belong? If you look at the picture on the right, that's Kelowna. You've got people who are putting subdivisions deeply into fire-prone ecosystems. So in many respects, the fire problem may not be the fires themselves, but the fact that we've inserted communities into fire-driven ecosystems and made ourselves vulnerable and exposed to a natural phenomenon. Like if we built all our houses in floodplains, eventually it might catch up to us. So those are the drivers of the wildfire crisis. And when you talk about how to manage through the wildfire crisis, there are a ton of things you need to do. I'm not going to get into the full suite of management tools and levers you need to pull. That's a longer conversation. This talk is particularly about one emerging idea, which is the idea that more beneficial fire will help us be more resilient. And our team, and when we started our project almost 3 years ago, wrote ourselves these postcards from the future. And one of the postcards is, if we could dream of a fire resilient world, we would have more beneficial fire and less destructive fire. Pretty simple. You don't want the bad ones, you want more of the good ones. So that's kind of like our vision that this talk is centered around. If you take that idea and say, that would lead you to a more resilient place and a safer place for communities, that's what we're trying to get at. So where is this term beneficial fire kind of coming from? And where is it starting to emerge, and who's talking about it? For those of you who are real wildfire geeks or aficionados, California is really one of the lead thinkers around wildfire. First, because they're so damn rich. They have so much fire, and they experienced the wildfire crisis much, much earlier than we did. They're like 20 years ahead of the curve than most of North America. And then they have these really crazy losses. Like the Camp Fire, 250 people died. Like these crazy, crazy impacts on their communities. You saw Los Angeles last year, 10,000 homes destroyed. So they have a wildfire crisis, like in big terms. So they've done a ton of things around strategically trying to understand how they can mitigate fire and get themselves out of this problem. And they came up with something. The governor created a task force on beneficial fire, and they had a report, I think it's 2022, that defined the term beneficial fire and had like 50 pages of collective action from multiple levels of government, multiple jurisdiction, multiple scales. And it's really solid. Like it's really probably the first place where people thought about a comprehensive approach to get fire back in a way that benefited communities and ecosystems. So that was a big thinker. I will make a shout out to the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, who funds our project. And they have a definition of wildfire resilience. And one of their strategic objectives is this idea that if we do the right things in terms of how we manage our ecosystems, how we manage fire suppression, how we manage our understanding of fire and science, we could get to a place 20 or 30 years from now where more hectares that are burned are beneficial and less hectares that are burned are detrimental. So getting back to that idea, if you're out of balance, then moving that balance ahead. And that's kind of their long-term vision. And then I also want to do a shout out to people who are doing forest landscape planning, which gets a bit of a bad rap these days because it's slow, but it's really freaking hard work. And the Lakes Forest Landscape Plan has a draft that's out for public review. If you're super interested in planning, it's worth taking a look at. And they talk in their draft objectives about what their future forests would look like and how they would encourage resilience. And they talk about reducing the size of the largest wildfires. So we don't like big wildfires. Down there, they've had the 100,000 hectare wildfires, Nadina Fire and others. So reducing the size of wildfires, not eliminating fires, not stopping all fires, but trying to reduce the most significant ones. Reducing the severity of the largest fires, because severity tends to lead to larger consequences on ecosystems. And then they talk specifically about increasing what they called wanted, prescribed and cultural fires. So getting some of the fires back on the land that you design explicitly because they have an objective in mind about achieving ecological outcomes or cultural outcomes or food outcomes in the case of putting berries back on the landscape. So that's kind of an emerging place where you're seeing this term used in sort of strategic planning, landscape planning, and so on. But before we talk about that, I want to just go into this question of baselines. The headline on the right, Canadian wildfires are record-breaking and will threaten U.S. air quality for days. But the question is, when are our records? Well, wildfire information is a modern thing. And in Canada, it dates pretty much from the 50s. There's some pretty good information for BC from the 20s. We're one of the earlier places that recorded wildfires. But when you talk about any number, you got to ask, what's your baseline? And our baseline is essentially from the 50s when you talk about records. And the 50s, in a lot of BC, in particular our part of the world, there was a lot more fire before the 50s. A lot more fire. And in that modern period, Indigenous fire is absent. So we're talking about a record in a time when Indigenous fire has been removed from the landscape. Fire suppression began. So we had already started to affect the fire regime and started to slow down fire suppression. And we had a really wet phase in our climate. It's absolutely clear about the climate records and so on. It was wet and cool. So we actually had probably a naturally quiet period of fire. So just really pay attention when you see these terms record. What's the baseline? What's the baseline? What's the baseline? And if it was against a very low part of the baseline, is that really a relevant measure for what's considered a good fire? If you read the TIE, they've done some really interesting reporting. The graphs on the left represent some of their stuff from, I think, from 2024. And that's an example of how these records are used to tell the story of wildfire in BC. And the top graph is the number of record-breaking years stacked up. So on the left is the lowest years, and on the right is the highest years. And you'll see our most recent fires, 2021, 17, 18, 23, are the record-breaking fires for years for area burned. And you'll see they noted in red. And what is the signal of red? Red is generally a signal of bad, right? So the message that these graphs give is that we've got an accelerating area burn, true, but it's also that it's bad. And the message back to the public is, if that's our problem, what's our solution? Our solution is suppress, put out the fires. That's the mental model that we all grew up with in the 50s, that you need to see these larger areas burn. We need to put more energy into suppression. We do a better job of suppression, which I think is actually partly true. We'll come back to a more complex story. But our current baseline and the way we report it, does that reinforce a perception that more fire is always bad? Like, that's the question you want to ask. And this idea that fire is bad, you get lots of headlines. Fires are devastating. Probably true if you're in a community and getting evacuated in Saskatchewan. Wildfire crisis, probably true for some places where, Yellowknife, they had to evacuate an entire town, including people in the hospital. Right? That's a crisis. I will say absolutely. But I think we just need to be more careful about fire is always bad in these kind of situations compared to an emerging narrative that some fire is good. So shout out to Matt Simmons, who's a local reporter. He's done a couple of papers in trying to get at this other story of the return of cultural fire with Gitmeow and the work Kira Hoffman's doing. Some work with BC Wildfire Service in a particular fire, try to highlight how you can use different ways and actually see that these fires, sometimes either putting them on the landscape or allowing them to burn on the landscape, are actually trying to create benefits for us that people are not aware of and don't rise to the top of the story compared to the evacuation and the damage to the houses and the mortality. So in our project, we were trying to get at this question of, if some kind of fires are wanted and others are not wanted, how do you tell, right? How can you as a planner or a manager or a wildfire official sort of tell, where do I want to basically let some of these fires get encouraged and where do I want to be like really hard? And so we did a little definition. It's a working definition, called it planned or unplanned wildland fire that has positive effects on the ecosystem and process and function and has acceptable risk to human communities. So it's both things. Try to get at the community side. Can we live with this fire, not have unacceptable damage, while we get the ecological benefits, particularly in fire-driven ecosystems that need fire to basically continue to establish their ecological processes. And one thing that's really critical in this is that these two dimensions, that community side, sometimes they're harmonized. There's this kind of view that there's a kind of quiet fire and so on, where they're just, it's all good for communities and good for ecosystems. Sometimes that ain't the case. That's the hard part, is that when you get fires that may actually be beneficial for ecosystems, but they're right in someone's backyard and they could risk their house, then you get a tension point and you have a harder job trying to figure out what the alignment is between those kind of fires and figuring that out as a manager. So We proposed a simple framework that talked about beneficial fire in a two-dimensional framework. It's oversimplified. But basically what we said is a detrimental fire is something that's bad for communities and ecosystems. A beneficial fire is good for communities and ecosystems. And you measure that in terms of the left dimension, which is risk to communities. If that fire has low risk to communities, you're down on the green. It's fine. The community's managed its risks, accepted the risk. If your fire is positive for an ecosystem, that means it's probably closer to being what that ecosystem experienced. Those of you familiar with emulating natural disturbance, that would be the theory. If it's similar to what that ecosystem had, that fire is probably going to be more close to a beneficial fire ecologically. And this will come out how you sort of assess that, but you can just think of it. Is it similar to what existed? Can the ecosystem function with that kind of fire? And can the communities live with it in terms of low risk? And so that's our very oversimplified framework. And then how do you actually understand that? How do you take that idea and apply it as planners or managers? And there's kind of two parts. The ecological dimension requires you to understand your fire regime, right? And your fire regime is made up of fire size. How big are they? Some places tend to have very small fires. Other places, like the boreal forest, we're talking rippers. 500,000 hectare fire was not uncommon in the boreal forest. But let me tell you, if you went down to Washington State, a 500,000 fire would be way outside of what was historically found in that particular ecosystem. So fire size matters. Severity, fires that burn very little of the vegetation, leave a lot of it standing. That's a low severity fire. Again, that's common to some ecosystems, but some ecosystems like ours experienced a lot of high severity fire where the whole forest gets destroyed. That's what the natural process was, not exclusively, because there was some low severity fire and moderate severity fire, but fire severity matters. Fire frequency, how often does a site burn? A site that burns every 30 years, chaparral forests outside Los Angeles burn every 30 years. That's really different than an upper subalpine forest that might burn every 250 years ecologically. Fundamentally different in terms of fire frequency. And then you can talk about seasonality and ignition source. So those are the things you need to understand in your ecosystem. Where am I with those kind of characteristics if you're going to understand how fire operated in your ecosystem? When you talk about the fire regime, you got to think big scales. It's not a site. It's big areas. The fire regime kind of moves around. It's got some heterogeneity. And so you're talking in our part of the world, like multi-hundreds of thousands of hectares to understand a fire regime. And you also have to look at over fairly long periods of time. So it's not a season. That's not a fire regime. It's how a pattern adds up over the wet years, plus the dry years, and then the other years. And one year you got a lightning bust, and that happened to be a lot of fire. So you got to have a long enough time to understand the fire regime to actually see patterns start to emerge that shape our landscapes. And then you also, I just want to emphasize, I'm talking a lot about how we understand the historical fire regime, but I think Phil was going to attend and he's been on me. We got to also look to the future. Like you cannot manage, particularly in a changing climate, simply by looking through the rear view mirror at our historical fire regime. You have to start to understand where it is going because it will be different. Sorry, folks, we've left the part of the world. We're in the Anthropocene. We will have very different fire regimes, very different weather conditions, very different landscape patterns. And so understand the past, understand where you're at today, but you also then need to turn your mind as managers to managing for that future fire regime. If it gets wetter or hotter or faster or slower. I want to say a little bit about the NDT system. Most people here are familiar with the NDT system in British Columbia. It is great, but it is outdated. It was built in 1995 for a particular purpose, and it's only a very partial description of the fire regime. So I won't go into a lot of detail. There's some interesting work I'll talk about trying to find something that gives you better resolution. But don't think that the NDT system is a description of the fire regime. It's a partial description of a part of the fire regime. And you'll see some work we'll allude to where we're going to try and give a better description of the fire regime in the Bulkley Morice that gives you some of those other variables. And I'll talk about some of them in a bit. Key concept here in the fire regime is this fire deficit and burn rates. There's a great paper by a guy named Sean Parks and Lori Daniels contributed. And basically, they concluded, based on the available data, that across most of North America, there is a fire deficit. Even though we've had more fire in the past decade, you still have a fire deficit. Well, what is a fire deficit? It just means you're less than you used to have. If you used to have 2 and now you got 1, you're in a fire deficit. So you can sort of use that as a very simple benchmark. If there was a lot of fire on the landscape and you're seeing a lot less, you're in a fire deficit. And I thought their summary points are really good. Forest managers and general public may be surprised to learn a significant fire deficit persists in many forested ecosystems, even as contemporary socioeconomic fire impacts are increasing. So ecologically, you don't have as much fire as you used to have, but you got increasing socioeconomic impacts, back to those 2 dimensions. And then you still got even the recent decades. This is back to, we had fiery decades. Like we've seen this last decade, more fiery. We are still much lower than historic rates across most of the continent. And the picture on the right just shows a really cool graphic of how that operates. You had a historic rate up until the turn of the century. And then it started declining with fire suppression. And then you're down in this trough where you've got very little fire, probably before 2000. And then after 2000, when the climate started to really twig, you started to see increasing fire rates, and it's headed somewhere different. Fire return interval is the reverse. The reason I show this graph, it's a little hard to read, but it's from Jen Barron, and it's a picture of the work she did in the Kootenays. Those of you who can use your imagination, that's a picture of the East Kootenays down in Cranbrook, sits around the middle, right about there. So this is the trench ecosystem, ponderosa pine, classic dry forests where there was really frequent fire. Like they talk about historic fire return intervals of 10 to 20 years. Fire happened a lot. It happened at low severity. So this is a classic example of how you basically had a very high frequency fire regime, highly interrupted by fire suppression and modern management. So the picture on the right is this idea of fire regime departure. How far am I departed from the historic? So if I used to have 1 fire per 10 years and I've been 50 years without a fire, I'm 5 times departed. Super simple concept. But the core is it starts to give you a picture that some fire regimes are really far departed. They're really missing fire. Others are closer. Others where you had really long fire intervals, 200-year fire return intervals, are not yet in big fire deficits or missing a high fire departure. So really cool tool, but it gets to this idea that some places are quite a ways out of what you might call a historic fire return. This is a paper came out in 2025 that looked at decadal burn rates. In other words, how many hectares in a particular zone burned in a decade. And it looked at the period of 2014 to 2023, so that decade ending in that massive fire year in Canada, like 10 or 12 million hectares. I can't remember the number. It's like a massive area burned, including the Northeast went nuts, right? Northeast BC, the boreal forests. And here's the interesting part. Even with that big fire year, decadal burn rates are still within the historic variability of the past 2 centuries. So back to that wildfire crisis, big records, but still not outside of what would have occurred prior to the 20th century. Interesting though, and I thought this is really a follow-up piece, burn rates in 2 zones, including the zone that include Northeast BC, were close to the highest decadal burn rates since the 1800s. And that was in 2023. And since then, we've had 2024 and 2025. So my suspicion is Northeast BC is outside its historic variability now. I don't have the numbers to prove it, but if they were close and you had another couple big years and Northeast BC was another 800,000 hectares and then 500,000 hectares, like big years, I would guess you are now seeing decadal burn rates that go outside the historic range. So back to, if you care about ecosystem sort of function, are we now approaching a place where climate change is moving you outside what occurred in the past? I'm going to talk one more concept, which is fire severity. There's a lot published on fire severity, not much in British Columbia. And fire severity is one of those key kind of concepts about understanding your fire regime and understanding fire effects. This particular study was from Eastern Washington and Oregon, both the wet and the dry side. And they found contemporary fire years are best characterized as not too much fire, but rather too little, right? So we got a lot of fire, but in fact, from an ecological perspective, they still have too little fire from an ecological perspective. And then beneficial fire years may not be those with less, but rather more area burned, but also with characteristic severity and patch distributions. So if you get a lot of area burned and it's outside your historic severity, and this is the problem in a lot of the dry forest, they're getting rippers that tear the entire crown forest, right? So it's 90% dead everywhere, where traditionally that might have been a low severity fire regime, leaving trees alive, leaving structure, leaving seed sources. So you need to start to plan to think about how severity is similar to or departed from the severity that your ecosystem functioned by. This is a really big deal, severity in the dry forest in the US. California, I think it was California, did a study, and this severity problem and fires burning at uncharacteristic and then not being able to reseed, they're going to lose 30% of their forest the next 50 years. 30% will be gone. They will be turned to grasslands or something else. So for them, it's kind of like, that's a problem, right? For watersheds and for all sorts of other reasons. So the fire problem can start to translate into really cascading impacts. So concept is, how similar is fire severity to historic levels? There's a really great report, the Department of Natural Resources in Washington. Partly I just like the title, The Work of Wildfire, right? I'm just going, that's a great title, because it implies that wildfire is actually doing something for you. And what wildfire is doing, sometimes, not always, is helping you manage fuels. If you've got overaccumulation of fuels because of suppression and so on, it is reducing some of your fuels. It's also restoring ecological function. If you're outside the historic range and you need to bring fire back, wildfires are putting that back on the landscape for you. So in the States, there's an enormous push, like we're talking industrial push to manage fuels. And they've got a lot of money behind it, but what they're finding is they can't keep up. And maybe wildfire is doing a lot of that work in terms of treating the landscape for them. So they found in this particular year, and I can't remember which year this came from, 2023, wildfire reduced fuels on 62,000 acres that burned at low and moderate severity. That's double the amount of prescribed fire and pile burning completed each year on average. So pretty good. Wildfire's doing something for you. And then dry forests experience this uncharacteristically severe impact compared to the historic fire regimes. They're getting too much high severity fire. So that's, again, how you can document these kinds of concepts, and that guides management a little bit. Great report. So kind of the key message here is that if you assess your fire regime, it's kind of hard work. It's new thinking. It's a ton of science. We don't have some of the data that we need, particularly in places like Northwest BC. We have big data gaps. But if you can do it, you can improve our understanding of the fire, how fire shapes your ecosystems, and help us understand whether wildfires are having ecological benefits or not. Are they really having these catastrophic impacts? Are they actually helping us? And sometimes there's a bit of both. I'm going to turn to the Bulkley Morice Wildfire Resilience Project. And I'll start with sort of just making sure I'm clear on what we do. It's a longer story, but we're a socio-ecological paradigm, which means we look at both the community dimension, that impact to communities and hazard and, you know, our homes burning down and at risk, as well as this impact to ecosystems. And are we having something that we can live with or like on our ecosystem? And how we're doing is we're providing knowledge and information to decision makers, some of who are in the room. One thing we're doing is that we're trying to reconstruct as best we can with available information what the fire regime is for this. Some of you may have attended. Phil Burton gave a teaser on the work that he's done of trying to look back at what we know about historical burn rates. And we're going to do some more kind of work on this. But the graph on the left, which is kind of hard to see, basically just captures a ton of studies that have been done and describes what did they find the burn rate to be. Burn rate being how many hectares burn per year in an area. And if Phil was here, he could explain it better than I can, but It's a logarithmic scale. So when you see a number 0.01 and 0.10, the difference between something a little ways up is a really big difference. And what you see as a pattern, prior to the 20th century, we had burn rates up in the ones for this particular ecosystem. And then in the 1950s, you had burn rates of 0.1, a tenth. Like we went way, way down. Call that the fire deficit. And then what you see around the 2000s, you're cracking back up again to 0.7s and 0.8s. So we'll try and present this a bit better in the next time, but you get the picture that we have likely had high rates of burn in the past, a period of decline in burn rates, and then an increasing period that we're experiencing now. And then some more work that we've done, stay tuned, to try and figure out where those burn rates differentiate in our ecosystems. The SBS-DK is a lot burnier than the SBS-MC, for example. So you actually have different burn rates in different parts of the ecosystem. Did I go on that one? Yeah. We're also doing some work on the community dimension. And this is oversimplified as trying to understand risk. Wildfire risk is broken down. It's a bit different than risk in a lot of other domains, but hazard and vulnerability. I'll try and simplify it. Hazard is like, if you think about an earthquake, hazard is what's the chance of an earthquake happening and how big is it? Vulnerability is my house on an earthquake prone zone, i.e. the Fraser Valley is worse than somewhere else? And will my house fall down? So vulnerability is about whether your house is vulnerable to the impact. So think about hazard and vulnerability as those two things. BC has some tools for doing this, but I'll say they have some gaps. And so we're going to try and provide some improvements to the Bulkley Morice in terms of the tools that are normally used for assessing risk. We will be, this is a bit of a teaser, looking at vulnerability. We hope to bring a tool to assess the vulnerability of built environment. In other words, how likely is it that a home will burn as opposed if it encounters a fire? Because it really depends on how it's built and where it's placed and how many trees are around it and things like that. That's coming. But right now, what we've been focusing on is this understanding the hazard through this model that our very brilliant modeling team has built. And I'll just give you a teaser. Don't take pictures of this because it's going to change probably. But we have started to run a model that combines things like where lightning might ignite, along with what your fuel types are, along with where your wind comes from. And it starts to give you a relative hazard picture. So the model essentially burns a ton of fires and then says, where is it likely to burn? How big is it likely to burn? And color codes the map according to places that are more likely to burn. So that's one part of hazard. You care, if this place is more likely to burn, I want to be more careful about how I site my community. And then we also have some work around trying to find out how intense the fire is. Is it really, really, really hot? Essentially, how much energy is it producing? And that depends on fuels and other stuff. So this is a tool that helps managers understand where their hazard is greatest. And that then lets you figure out, what could I do about that? So we have some work to complete the model, and then we're going to start to explore some management scenarios, which is back to, can you cool down the landscape essentially by managing your forests differently? Can you take that hazard, cool it down in some places to make it more acceptable? That's going to come in spring and summer. And I'll just say, I think we have it booked to release some of the model results in June at a seminar. So stay tuned. You'll see more about the hazard work in June. So the summary is, you can inform what constitutes beneficial fire or what constitutes resilience by looking at your ecosystem, looking at your current fire regime, comparing it to your historics, thinking about, is my burn rate the same, lower, is it going higher? Understanding fire size, are they getting bigger, smaller, different? And understanding severity, more high severity, less high severity. And you can look at your community dimension, understanding your hazard. Are we getting more hazard? Is it getting worse? Are we doing things that make it better? You can also start to understand your vulnerability. You can manage your communities to be less vulnerable. And then you got to, look into the future. How's that changing over time? We'll get to that, a different topic, because it's going to be really interesting to see how we do that. I'm going to quickly talk about an example. If anyone remembers Powers Creek Fire 2023, I think it was like July 8th. That fire just back on that side of the hillside in Smithers ignited above some people's houses. There was evacuation order for a bunch of the homes nearby. Fire was put out after about 8 days. It was in subboreal forests in a place that had a mixed severity fire regime. So the question I would ask, if you think about whether that fire was characteristic of the ecosystem, where would it have occurred on this particular framework? Was it closer to the green or closer to the red? And from a risk perspective, was it closer to the red or closer to the green? Anybody want to guess? What up your assessment? There's no right answer. It's just kind of like what we think. Yeah, so you have to think about before they suppressed it, because suppression was their management response. Yeah, it's a great point. I would say it's somewhere in here. That fire was characteristic of the ecosystem. If there were not houses nearby, it was probably something that's doing some good up on that hillside. Ecologically, returning kind of shrub communities and forest type that historically occurred. It was probably not going to cause a lot of ecological damage from an ecological process perspective. And it wasn't crazy high risk. But the people who got evacuated were probably worried, right? It was close to Smithers, and it got very aggressive suppression. Like let's hammer this puppy because it's July and we don't know where this is going to go. So it's an example of where a lot of our fires, I think particularly in our ecosystems, may be less uncharacteristic than we think. And a lot of our fires are pretty high risk to communities if they're near communities. So we'll talk a bit more about what kind of fires are beneficial then. I am not an expert on cultural fire or Indigenous fire stewardship, but I think there's a growing recognition that Indigenous communities have historically and wish to in the future put fire on the landscape that meets their community needs, but also meets particular needs that our ecosystems are adapted to, whether that's burning for berries or, the Gitxsan are talking about forest gardens that were maintained by placing fire on the landscape, or for other purposes, wildlife and open spaces. So there's a whole chapter. I think Kira is going to be giving a presentation in March at the seminar series about some of the work she's doing. And then you've got this prescribed fire. Intentional fires, usually to improve habitat, reduce fuels, or restore ecosystem function. The picture on the right is down in the Similkameen of a grassland fire. Classic, a place that needs fire to get rid of the sagebrush and restore grassland functions. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about managed wildfire, talk about the work of wildfire, and wildfires in the category of managed wildfire, which is an emerging kind of concept. I'm not an expert in wildfire response. There's people in the room who are, but BC does kind of manage fires in 3 bases. Full response, just get the puppy out because it's too risky. And then monitor response, is it so remote we don't need to put resources into it. We'll let it burn for ecological function. And in the middle is this category called modified response, where there's maybe not an immediate threat to values, and there is recognized that there may either be some ecological necessity or value, and maybe we don't have enough suppression resources. But regardless, they're not putting it out as aggressively as in the first category. And this is the kind of emerging, it was like 2009 that BC switched to actually explicitly saying that we can allow some fires to burn because they have this ecological benefit and we're not worried about the risk to communities. And I didn't realize this, but Steve Taylor, who works with the CFS, shared me some data that came from Ministry of Forests that about 28% of the fires between 2009 and 2024 were done under modified response. So modified response is not uncommon and is, I think, going to be a growing part of that work of wildfire as we go forward. I want to stress modified response and managed wildfire are not exactly the same thing. And this is going to be an emerging topic of conversation about how and when do fire managers take the decision to allow a fire to burn. And it's tricky because what's the season? You're not going to let one burn in July, probably, because what if it blows up in August and you have resources pinned down? The community may say, we're not cool with you allowing that fire to burn. Did anybody hear the Grand Canyon Lodge burning down last year? Grand Canyon Lodge, north rim of the Grand Canyon, the iconic drive to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, this beautiful structure burned down, and the US went wild because it was a managed wildfire. that got away after the Park Service allowed a fire, said, we're not going to put it out aggressively because we need ecosystem function. So they let it burn, and the weather popped badly. It blew up to 100,000 acres and burned a really iconic structure. It was national news in the United States. So that's an example of where take a risk, it can be really, really difficult and can go badly. Side note, it had a shingle roof and should not have had a shingle roof. Just really silly. So there's a lot of conversation that we need to have about this idea of managed wildfire and when it's appropriate and when it's safe to allow more fires to burn. Final kind of closing notes. Beneficial fire is ultimately in the eye of the beholder. Every community is going to have to grapple with how much risk it can tolerate, how much smoke it can tolerate, whether it wants its smoke now from some fires or whether it wants to wait till it's really catastrophic and it's going to get a big glug of smoke because you have an overaccumulation of fuels. Do you want large fires? Do you want severe fires? Like you sort of really have to start to think about what kind of landscape you want. And what are the ecological benefits if you get more fire at the right time in the right place? And that's going to be a really critical part of it. Some places would be like, yeah, that's great. We really understand that that's safe, that needs it. And other places like, no, we definitely don't want to have more fire there. And how can we encourage culture and prescribe fire and more managed wildfire? Those are going to be really big conversations. So how do we do that? How do we get there? I hope this is maybe a bit planning policy geeky stuff. But to be blunt, I think if you understand your fire regime, it'll start to become more clear how you make those choices. If you understand how fire operates in your ecosystem, you'll understand better which ones might be obviously not very good and obviously very good and some hard stuff in the middle. You need to do this locally. It's not a top-down exercise that comes from Victoria because it's very community-based. It's very risk-based. It's very local-based in terms of where people's preferences are. And even if an agency does it, if government or First Nation says, we think it's going to be this, if the communities aren't with you, that's not going to work because they're going to still pick up the phone when they see that fire and go, what are you folks doing? I want it out, right? So you have to really think about how these conversations socialize these ideas, bring people along, and change the conversation. And the last thing in terms of, I've realized this is very policy oriented. I said, well, and some people are just out there doing it. So you actually see people who are putting more beneficial fire back on the landscape. There have been some prescribed burns in this area each of the last couple of years. There's an emerging fire stewardship set of programs with different First Nations. So some people are just kind of getting on with bringing fire back to the land in the right place and the right time. And maybe just kind of a last comment about a lot of this is about culture. It's about how we frame problems. It's about the hidden assumptions we have in our heads. And we grew up with Smokey the Bear. And Smokey the Bear says, put all fires out because all fires are bad. That is a cultural assumption that is deeply ingrained in our society. Ember the Firefox, on the other hand, is this new mascot for Fire Smart that says, fire's good. Like, I can live with fire. It's great. It's helpful. And it's going to take a long time before we switch from that kind of Smokey the Bear approach to more of an Ember the Firefox approach. And I think that's it. Time for a few questions, I hope, yeah. Yeah, there you go. Actually, that's funny because 58 shows up and I couldn't tell which fires that was because I wasn't around, I'm proud to say. But yeah, 58 showed up as a really big fire here in BC. Yeah, and I know a lot of them are these northern fires, but yeah, you get big fires around Prince George. That's great. I probably don't want to speculate too much, but I'll offer what I've heard some other people say. First, if you think about Hudson Bay Mountain, you think about where it is relative. Are you talking about managing the mountain or managing the mountain and Smithers, like the interface between it? Because oh, the cabins, right? Oh, the cabins. Actually, you know what? So yeah, I forget. Some people have cabins up on the mountain. So let me say two things. One is it's not a very fire-prone ecosystem. So if you actually look at it, hasn't burned historically that much. It's got subalpine fir, and in that kind of place, it's like, well, you got pretty low probability of burning. How do you keep your cabin from burning? just fire smart the craziness out of it. No wood piles next to the house, no grass mats, keep your trees 5 feet away. Like, I think there's 3 rules for fire smart. No wood roof, 3mm vents on all your screens, and 1.6 meters with no flammable material. And if you do those things, even if a fire burns nearby, you're not likely to lose your place. So you don't need to worry in some places as much about the ecosystem as you do about protect your house. And it's actually some very simple steps that you can take that really reduce the probability of burning your house, your cabin. Yep. Yeah, no, a great question. I know you guys are thinking a ton about this, and they're actually, Flagstaff is super far ahead in Arizona and some of the U.S. Forest Service about trying to move towards more beneficial fire. I'll relay a story a colleague of ours on our team call this week shared as he's going to do a presentation with some really smart leaders in the field that he works in. And he was asked about, to do a presentation on fire and beneficial fire. And he asked them, said, well, what do you folks think about fire? Is it bad or is it good? 100% fire is bad. Now, these are really thoughtful people who are really well informed. They've been paying attention. And then their response is back to, well, therefore we need to suppress it. Like, so I think it's that deep cultural ingrained idea that it takes a long time to shift from people who grow up as kids out there helping light a fire and being taught that we're not to be afraid of it and being taught that it's actually a process that we need to bring in. You're going to have to start with that, changing that culture that fire good. And so I think it's that long-term cultural shift that's so deeply embedded, we don't even know it. I mean, I'll say I use the term wildfire crisis. I sometimes wonder whether I should, because I'm silently sort of getting at that idea that this fire is necessarily bad. And I do it because I believe it's bad because we're not ready for it. But I'm not sure that saying it doesn't actually in some ways exacerbate that problem. There is a lot of, I'll call it advocacy science. And I think what we're trying to do in this particular project is move away from the advocacy science and really just get to what do we understand about our fire regime? What do we understand about our risks and how they work? But I will say there's going to be a hard question because you're going to come to some places where what you want from an ecological process will collide with public safety. That's going to be the hard part, where there's going to be just a community choice that has to be made about, do you prioritize public safety or can you compromise a bit on that? Where do you achieve your full ecological function? And similar in our part of the world, a fully natural fire regime in subboreal forests is big fires that rip occasionally. That's probably not going to be friendly to timber supply. So we're going to have a second sort of socioeconomic collision between the need to maintain some sort of stability of your fire of timber supply while still allowing some of our natural fire regime to operate. So it's choices. I will offer one of the things I come back to is the national parks have had a longstanding goal to return their fire regime, and they're conservation-oriented organizations. And they actually have an objective that says we will maintain a percentage of the historic fire, not all of it, because even in a national park, with the fact that there are people there, they can't burn everywhere, they have towns, Jasper, Lake Louise, Banff, those kind of towns. Even a national park is going to struggle to fully return 100% to a natural fire regime. So we're going to have choices, and we're going to just have to kind of face them. And I hope it's not through advocacy science. Yes. Are we able? Yes, there are tools that can do a good job of reducing fire. You don't eliminate, it's back to these kind of risk management tools. You reduce risk, and at some point you get to the fact you've reduced it enough to make a meaningful difference, but you don't eliminate it unless you essentially pave it. However, I think the larger question is, are our practices today doing that? That is a larger debate. And I would say, as a former chair of the Forest Practices Board, I have some esteem for their work. I would read their report that came out in the spring that concluded that there are significant missed opportunities in current forest practices regarding fuel management. In other words, they are not doing the practices that would take you to the kind of quality of fuel management that we need to protect communities. So yeah, could get there, but there's significant room for improvement. Yeah, you're asking a very interesting question of which there is much debate. The answer is yes. The current thinking in that particular prescription is it will reduce some of the intensity, and I think it was done for egress routes. There is some debate about whether we really understand what will happen on those kind of sites, and that comes back to that we don't have some of the base data that really test this. I'll just reinforce, we never did this stuff, right? Like if you look at what we understand about things like tree planting, we're pretty good at tree planting. We know what trees survive on what sites because we did it for 40 years and it just got better and we had research and all those kinds of things. We're essentially moving into a world of fuel management where there was very little done on the landscape, where we didn't do a lot of research around it. And now we're playing a large catch up. So that comes back to that knowledge gap. I would say there are people who would say that those practices were not as effective as they could have been. Other people will say they were. And I would say we don't have enough of the empirical research to be really conclusive about that.
That really ties into question and some thoughts from Lori Daniels. So increasingly beneficial fire also requires pre-fire fuel management in forests, altered by fire exclusion and suppression so that you can introduce lower severity fire. And the majority of forests in BC have been altered over the last century.
Yes. Yeah, no, and this is probably the learning where you've got, Lori's getting at is this idea that if your forest is now outside of what it could have been in a fire maintained system in particular, you can't just go light it up, right? Because if you light it up, you've got so much fuel that you will start to have a kind of fire that was uncharacteristic and causes that high severity fire that isn't what you want. And this is what gets controversial, particularly in the dry forests, that the ecological requirement is to go get some of that fuel off the landscape first, then reintroduce fire, because it now won't burn at that characteristic high severity. So, and the problem is removing that fuel requires some sort of mechanical treatment, either with machines or humans and chainsaws, and it's really expensive, and people don't like it because that's a form of logging. Even though it's not logging, it's fuel management. They're not the same. But this is probably the big debate, both in the States. There's a lot of animosity around this particular debate. There's camps, which I don't think are particularly helpful. And so, yeah, that's a big topic. Yeah, no, and I think this will be a discussion we'll probably have in another seminar sometime in the next while. What's the difference between logging is logging, fuel management is fuel management, and sometimes fuel management requires logging, and sometimes it doesn't. And so there is this intersection that you really need to tease apart. And as you say, I think it's legitimate. There are some folks who see fuel management and the wildfire necessity or treatment as just a great way to move forward with a logging agenda. Clearly, there are some people who believe that. That's not, I think, appropriate and necessary, but that is out there. Yeah, so I'm going to say this is an interesting area. Fires definitely, let's call a natural fire, resets and has ecological value. It also can reduce fuel loads and become less likely to burn until the trees fall over, and then it becomes more likely to burn. So there's a lot of questions now about whether fire salvage is, and I should say fire salvage is clearly not going to be the best thing ecologically if you have to build roads, and you take off legacies, and you disturb soil and all those kind of pieces. So you've got some downsides. You've also got some places where it might reduce the probability of secondary burns or third burns. So there's an interesting debate about whether or not there are some places where you might want to, they call it finish the work of the wildfire that reduced your fine fuels and remove at least a portion of those fuels on a portion of the fire to reduce the risk of secondary burns. So I'm just going to say it's an interesting topic, and for sure there are downsides to salvage. There also might be some upsides in some places. So it's going to be a harder one to figure out. Wildfire resilience is bigger than beneficial fire, but I would say beneficial fire is probably one of the ways that you would get to wildfire resilience, not the only pathway. Wildfire resilience is when both your communities and your ecosystem can cope with the change that you're experiencing from fire. And that's partly why it's bigger, because your community side, for example, might just be, do you have the financial resources to rebuild after? That's going to be a key part of your community's resilience to wildfire. Is if houses burn down, can we reestablish ourselves? Can your community's economic needs or your watersheds survive fire? Can they actually handle the sediment loads that come after more fire and those kind of pieces? So wildfire resilience is bigger, and beneficial fire is kind of one plank in the toolkit to get to wildfire resilience. It's a sensitive thing, and there's actually been a politically sensitive thing that's been through the legislature in places like Oregon and Utah, where it's actually deeply politically divided over, do you publish the maps? The interesting thing is that insurance companies do not use publicly available maps for assessing wildfire risk. They have their own proprietary maps that come off of satellite data, and they're cranking it today, whether you like it or not. The interesting part is how publicly transparent information could start to actually help them make better decisions. Particularly, the discussion is if a community does the work to reduce its vulnerability and says, hey, we're good. We're a fire smart community. We've got all this. We're less likely to burn than we were 5 years ago. Can you incorporate that into their decision making so they don't either de-insure you or you can actually reduce premiums? So that's the other conversations that are happening, is how you actually can improve their decision making. But right now, they hire actuaries and climate modelers and all those people, and they're running big fat models on your house. I should say, we would not be publishing maps in our part. So anyway, there's conversation to make sure we don't create that risk around here if we do that. Oh boy. I would say the barrier right now is our increasing polarization of social dialogue. That is fundamentally our tribal instinct that's getting worse. Even if people want to have a conversation, I am deeply worried that wildfire should be a common problem, and wildfire is becoming tribalized. And I kind of look and go, that is in nobody's best interests. And I think that's just a reflection of the greater polarity in our particular debate. In British Columbia is not immune from, and our community is not immune from that. So I just think anyone who kind of gets a bit agitated, we just got to kind of put on our listening skills and our listening hats and try to see it from the other perspectives, and kind of find that there's it's a real conversation. If we're yelling at each other, it won't go far. All right. Thanks, everybody.